the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ocean, the Pescama fishing boat was supposed to be a place of work, a lifeline for its crew. But on that fateful night in 1996, what should have been just another shift at sea turned into one of the most brutal maritime tragedies in modern history. 11 lives were lost in a single, horrifying nighttime event that shocked the world. It wasn't the sea that claimed them, but violence, abuse, and betrayal that unfolded on board, changing the lives of those who survived and shaking the conscience of a nation. This is the chilling story of the Pescama fishing boat tragedy. In today's video, we dive deep into the brutal conditions aboard the vessel, the relationship between the crew and the ship's management, and the horrifying violence that led to the deaths of 11 men. What drove a group of desperate workers to murder their own captors? And what justice did they receive? Join us as we unfold the details of this shocking event, and stay tuned for the untold truths that surface in the aftermath. Part 1. The setting. A floating nightmare of vast, seemingly endless ocean is both a place of opportunity and peril. For those who make their living on the water, the harsh conditions of maritime life are a daily reality. On the Pescama fishing boat, a vessel with a primarily foreign crew, the ocean was not just their workplace, but their prison. With a crew consisting mostly of Chinese, Filipino, and Korean workers, life aboard the Pescama was a constant struggle for survival, not only against the unforgiving seas, but also against the men who controlled their fate. The story of the Pescama tragedy begins long before the violent events that transpired that fateful night in 1996. It is a tale of exploitation, abuse, and neglect that eventually erupted in the most horrifying of ways, leaving behind a legacy of tragedy that still resonates. Today, to understand what led to that night, we must first look at the conditions aboard the fishing vessel and exploitation of its crew. The Pescama's dark legacy. An international crew under Duras Pescama was a fishing boat that operated in the international waters off the coast of the Philippines. The vessel was part of a larger fleet that operated under the management of a Korean shipping company, which had a long-standing reputation for mistreating its workers. This wasn't an isolated case. The fishing industry has long been known for its poor working conditions, particularly for migrant workers, many of whom are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. However, the conditions aboard the Pescama were some of the worst. The workers on the Pescama were often subjected to harsh, physically demanding work with little to no rest. Their days were long and grueling, often starting at dawn and continuing until late into the night, with very little respite in between. The crew members were responsible for hauling in massive catches, processing fish, and maintaining the ship, all while battling the elements. But the work itself was not the only issue they faced. The crew also had to contend with a management system that was abusive and punishing. The Korean officers on the ship treated the foreign workers with disdain, often subjecting them to verbal and physical abuse. The crew was kept in isolated conditions, far from their families and with little hope of escape. They were isolated not only geographically, but emotionally and mentally. Many of the workers had no choice but to endure the abuse, because leaving the ship would have meant leaving their livelihood behind, often with little chance of finding work elsewhere. What made the situation even more dire was the fact that the workers had no recourse to report the abuse. Maritime law is often a gray area, particularly in international waters, and the workers on the Pescama had nowhere to turn for help. The management had a tight grip on the vessel, and there were no unions or labor protections for the foreign workers. Their lives were expendable to those in charge. The tensions escalate, building frustration for months leading up to the tragedy. Tensions aboard the Pescama had been rising. The abuse the workers endured had been ongoing, but over time, it began to take a toll on their mental and emotional states. Many of the workers felt trapped and powerless, constantly fearing for their safety. The language barrier only heightened the feeling of isolation, making it difficult for the workers to communicate their grievances. What was initially a manageable situation of exploitation turned into a ticking time bomb as frustrations reached a boiling point. Among the workers were 6 Chinese men who had been particularly vocal about their mistreatment. They had been subjected to some of the worst abuse, and their mental and physical states were deteriorating rapidly. They had all been working under the same conditions for months, and while they had tried to cope with the abuse in silence, it was clear that something had to give. These 6 men, the ringleaders of the rebellion, had already begun discussing a plan to escape the hell they were living in. They knew that if they stayed, their lives would continue to be a never-ending nightmare. It was a question of survival, and in the face of constant degradation, they began to think about drastic measures. The catalyst, a violent escalation that was in the final days, leading up to the tragedy, that the situation on board the Pescama became untenable. The final straw came when one of the workers, in a moment of frustration, was physically assaulted by one of the Korean officers. The assault was brutal, and it sent shockwaves through the crew. The abuse had always been a part of their lives. On the ship, But this particular incident was different. It was the breaking point for the workers. The Chinese workers, who had been planning their escape for weeks, finally decided that they couldn't wait any longer. They were no longer willing to endure the torture any longer. They knew that something drastic needed to be done, not just for their own survival, but to prevent the same fate from befalling others who came after them. The 6 Chinese workers, driven by a mix of fear, anger, and desperation, began to hatch a plan. They knew that they couldn't just confront the officers head-on. The officers were well-armed and far more experienced in hand-to-hand combat, but the workers also knew that they had the element of surprise on their side. They had been planning this moment for weeks, and now, with their nerves on edge, they felt it was the only way out. The night of the murders, the unthinkable happens in the night of May 2nd, 1996. The Pescama was in the middle of its routine fishing operation when the 6 Chinese workers made their move. They attacked the officers during the dead of night, catching them off guard while they were resting. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. One by one, the officers were struck with brutal force, leaving them with no time to react. The workers didn't stop at just incapacitating their captors. They knew that in order to escape the nightmare they had been living in, they had to eliminate the threat entirely. The killings were swift, but the brutality of the attack left little doubt about the workers' motivations. This wasn't a simple act of rebellion, it was an act of survival, a desperate attempt to break free from the grip of their abusers. But the violence didn't end there. After the officers were killed, the workers disposed of the bodies by throwing them into the sea. They wanted to make it seem as though their captors had disappeared mysteriously, leaving no trace of the violence that had just taken place. The aftermath of the killings was a mix of confusion and relief for the surviving workers. They had done what they felt they had to do to survive, but they were fully aware of the gravity of their actions. The crew knew that the events of that night would change their lives forever. The discovery of the bodies and the aftermath. When the authorities first began investigating the deaths aboard the Pescama, they were initially baffled. There were no survivors who could testify, and the bodies had been disposed of in the sea, leaving few clues as to what had really happened. The only evidence investigators had to work with were the wreckage of the boat and the accounts of the few surviving workers who had managed to escape. As the investigation unfolded, the true nature of the massacre slowly came to light. The workers who had been involved in the killings were eventually arrested, and their stories began to paint a grim picture of the abuse and mistreatment they had suffered. It was clear that the murders had been a result of years of ongoing violence, exploitation, and neglect. In the aftermath of the incident, the survivors were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. Some felt relief that they had finally escaped the abuse, while others struggled with the guilt of having taken lives in order to survive. The case of the Pescama tragedy raised difficult questions about justice, survival, and the limits of human endurance. The tragic legacy of the Pescama tragedy remains one of the darkest chapters in maritime history. The deaths of 11 men were not just the result of a violent outburst, but of a broken system that allowed abuse to go unchecked. The workers aboard the Pescama had been pushed to their breaking points, and in a moment of desperation, they took matters into their own hands. The tragedy is a stark reminder of the toll that exploitation can take on the human soul. For the families of the victims, the loss was heartbreaking, but for the survivors, the question remains, could there have been another way? Could they have escaped their circumstances without resorting to murder? These are the questions that continue to haunt those who were involved in the Pescama tragedy. As we look back at this tragic event, it serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths to which individuals will go when pushed to the edge of survival. The story of the Pescama fishing boat is one that will never be forgotten, and its lessons continue to resonate with those who hear it. Part 2. The Night of Horror. What really happened? The night of May 2nd, 1996 would become one of the darkest moments in maritime history. As the Pescama sailed quietly through the open waters, tensions between the workers and their Korean captors had reached a boiling point. It was the culmination of months, if not years, of mistreatment, abuse, and constant psychological torment. The workers, particularly the 6 Chinese men who had long been the most vocal about their mistreatment, had reached their breaking point. They could not endure the cruelty any longer. The crew had been subjected to physical violence on a daily basis. The Korean officers often beat the workers for small infractions or for no reason at all. Even worse, they were forced to endure extremely dangerous working conditions without proper protective gear. They lived in cramped, unsanitary quarters, with barely enough food to sustain them. Their lives were not just about hard labor, they were marked by the constant threat of violence. It was a brutal existence, one that made the workers feel as though they were trapped in an unrelenting nightmare. The 6 Chinese workers had discussed their options in whispers. During their sleepless nights, over time, their plan had been solidified. They knew that they would either have to die trying to escape or take the lives of their tormentors and hope to survive. Their minds had been set. This night would be the moment they took their lives back, but they knew that if they acted recklessly, they might end up dead or locked away in prison for the rest of their lives. The moment of violence. Attack in the dead of night be midnight. The Pescama had settled into its regular routine. The workers were busy with their various duties on deck, some processing the day's catch, others preparing the ship for the next fishing haul. The officers were supposed to be on a different shift, but many had stayed up late to monitor the crew. The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence of the night made the atmosphere even more oppressive. As the ship sailed in the open waters, the 6 Chinese men quietly positioned themselves, each of them mentally preparing for the grim task ahead. Their plan was simple, but brutal. They would take the officers by surprise and eliminate them. Quickly, they made their move in the dead of night, when the officers were less alert and the crew had dispersed to their designated sleeping quarters. Armed with knives and makeshift weapons they had fashioned in secret, they stormed the officers' quarters. The first wave of attack was swift and violent. One of the officers was knocked unconscious immediately, while the others were caught off guard. The Chinese workers overwhelmed them, using their weapons to subdue and kill the officers one by one. The assault was chaotic and bloody. The 6 men showed no mercy, their actions driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and desperation. The workers didn't have time to second-guess themselves. Their fate had been sealed. The moment they chose to rebel, the violence didn't stop there. The 6 workers quickly moved to the remaining officers, attacking them in a similar fashion. Some of the officers fought back, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. The bloodshed was horrifying, but the workers were determined to end their misery once and for all. By the time the workers had finished their bloody mission, 11 people had been killed. 8 of the ship's officers, who were mostly Korean, and 3 Filipino and Chinese workers who had been caught in the crossfire, were dead. The workers did not stop to reflect on what they had just done. They had one goal now: to cover up the crime and escape the wrath of the law. Covering their tracks, the body disposal in the aftermath of the killings, the surviving workers knew they had to act quickly to dispose of the bodies. They couldn't leave any evidence that might lead back to them, and they certainly couldn't afford to let the ship return with any sign of a massacre. Aboard, the bodies were hastily thrown into the ocean, sinking beneath the waves where they would be lost to the world. Some of the men were wrapped in heavy nets or other materials to weigh them down, but the workers did not take any chances. They were desperate to make it appear as though the officers had simply disappeared, not murdered. But there was a lingering problem. The ship still had to make its way back to port. The surviving workers couldn't just return to shore without raising suspicion, so they worked to make the ship appear as though nothing was amiss. They cleaned up the bloodstains, threw out any items that could connect them to the murders, and tried to keep their composure. Yet, no matter how much they tried to cover their tracks, they knew that what they had done would haunt them forever. The violence that had erupted that night was irreversible, and now they had to deal with the consequences. The investigation unraveling the mystery days after the Pescama returned to port. The gruesome crime was discovered. At first, authorities were unaware that a murder had taken place. The ship's return was uneventful, and it wasn't until the ship docked in port that things started to unravel. The bodies of the missing crew members, who had been reported lost at sea, were discovered floating in the water. The shock and confusion among local authorities turned to suspicion as they investigated further. At first, it appeared as though the officers had been lost in an unfortunate accident. Perhaps the boat had capsized or a storm had taken their lives. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that there was far more to the story. The survivors of the ship were the key to uncovering the truth. The authorities began questioning the surviving crew members, trying to understand how the men had died. Initially, the surviving workers remained tight-lipped, unwilling to divulge any details about what had happened that night. But as the pressure mounted, the cracks in their stories began to show. Some workers began to slip up, revealing inconsistencies in their accounts. Eventually, after several days of questioning, one of the surviving workers broke down and confessed to the murders. He admitted that he and several other crew members had killed the officers in an act of rage and desperation. He explained that they had been driven to violence due to months of brutal treatment and exploitation at the hands of their captors. The details of the confession were chilling. The surviving crew members had not acted out of pure malice, but out of the need to escape the brutality of their lives aboard the Pescama. However, this didn't absolve them of their actions. The murder of 11 people was a crime that could not be overlooked. The investigation continued, and as more confessions were made, the authorities began piecing together the full story. The surviving crew members were arrested and charged with the murders, though their motivations remained a subject of debate. Were they victims of their circumstances, pushed to the edge by abuse and neglect? Or were they cold-blooded killers who acted out of jealousy and anger? Conclusion: a tragic end to a dark story. The events of that night aboard the Pescama fishing boat became one of the most notorious maritime crimes in history. 11 lives were lost, and a complex investigation was required to untangle the motives behind the killings. The survivors of the massacre were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. Knowing that they had taken lives in order to escape their torment, the Pescama tragedy raised important questions about the treatment of migrant workers and the extreme lengths people will go to when pushed to the brink of survival. The tragic loss of life aboard that fishing boat was not the result of a simple crime of passion. It was the culmination of years of abuse and exploitation, where the workers felt that violence was their only way out. In the end, the story of the Pescama fishing boat serves as a stark reminder of the depths to which desperation can drive people and the lengths they will go to in order to protect their own lives. Part 3. The Aftermath. Unraveling the consequences of the Pescama tragedy. Horrific events that unfolded aboard the Pescama fishing boat on that fateful night in 1996 left the world in shock. 11 lives were lost, and the tragedy sparked a complex investigation that uncovered not only the brutal details of the murders, but also the disturbing conditions that had driven the workers to take such extreme measures. The aftermath of this tragedy would have long-lasting repercussions for the survivors, the families of the victims, and the wider world that had learned of the brutality that had occurred on the open seas. The immediate aftermath. Authorities react when the bodies of the murdered crew members began washing up along the shore. Authorities initially struggled to make sense of what had happened. The apparent disappearance of the officers had been puzzling, but the bodies so clearly and gruesomely disposed of indicated that something far more sinister had occurred. The fact that the Pescama had docked back at port without raising immediate alarms only complicated matters. However, as the investigation unfolded, it quickly became apparent that this was no ordinary maritime disaster. The workers' testimonies began to expose a much darker narrative. The survivors, initially reluctant to speak out, gradually began to open up under intense questioning. The violence they had endured on the ship was beyond anything anyone could imagine. The abuse, combined with the constant threat of death and the physical torment they faced at the hands of the officers, had pushed them into a corner where they felt no choice but to rebel. While the surviving workers maintained that the killings had been acts of survival, the police had their work cut out for them. The 6 Chinese workers who were initially involved in the violence had confessed to their roles in the murders, but the full extent of their motivations and actions needed to be understood in greater depth. Public reaction, shock, outrage, and sympathetic news of the Pescama tragedy quickly spread, making headlines around the world. The brutality of the killings, combined with the fact that they had occurred in a seemingly remote and forgotten part of the world, captured the attention of the public. The outrage was palpable. How could such an event have happened? How could a group of workers, who were already living in such deplorable conditions, be pushed to commit murder? But there was also an undercurrent of sympathy. Many people, particularly those familiar with the harsh realities of migrant labor, saw the workers as victims of a broken system, one that had failed them, had forced them into untenable situations. As more details emerged about the abuse the workers had faced, public opinion began to shift. People started to ask, could this tragedy have been avoided if the workers had been treated with basic human dignity and respect? The Pescama tragedy became more than just a sensational crime story. It became a focal point for discussions on the treatment of migrant laborers in the global fishing industry. For years, these workers had lived and worked in silence, their suffering largely ignored. But now, their voices were being heard, and the world was forced to confront the ugly truth about how the world's most vulnerable populations are often treated. The legal process, a struggle for justice. The investigation into the murders on the Pescama fishing boat quickly turned into a legal battle, with the surviving crew members facing serious charges of murder. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that the violence on board the ship was a result of both individual acts of rage and the cumulative effects of ongoing abuse. The trial that followed would raise complex legal and moral questions, particularly around issues of self-defense, extreme duress, and the legality of the workers' actions. While the prosecution sought justice for the deaths of the 11 crew members, the defense painted a different picture. The workers were not being charged with cold-blooded murder, the defense argued, but with acting in self-defense after enduring months of brutal treatment. The court was tasked with determining whether the workers had acted out of a desperate need to protect themselves or whether they had planned and executed the murders with malice. One of the most significant points of contention during the trial was whether the workers had been justified in taking the law into their own hands. Was it an act of survival, or was it a premeditated decision to take matters into their own hands in response to years of torment? The survivors testified that they had been pushed to their breaking point by their captors, and many expressed regret over the violence they had committed. But they maintained that it was their only option to escape the nightmare of their lives. On the Pescama, despite their claims of self-defense, The survivors faced significant legal challenges under international law. Murder is a crime regardless of the circumstances that led to it. The question of whether the workers could be held fully accountable for their actions would dominate the trial, the verdict, convictions, and sentence. After weeks of deliberation, the court found the surviving workers guilty of second-degree murder. They were convicted of killing their captors during the course of a crime. The court ruled that, while the workers had been subjected to extreme abuse, the brutality of their actions could not be justified as self-defense. The prosecution argued that the workers had shown clear intent to murder, particularly in how they disposed of the bodies. The sentences handed down were harsh. Several of the workers were sentenced to long prison terms, and others faced the death penalty. These sentences sparked further debate about the fairness of the verdict, with many questioning whether justice had been served. The survivors of the Pescama tragedy were now left to face the consequences of their actions. Some felt that the legal system had failed them, while others accepted the sentences as a necessary consequence of their violent actions. In the years that followed, the tragedy remained a subject of heated debate in both legal and social circles. The impact on the survivors and their families. For the surviving workers, the aftermath of the Pescama tragedy was a long and painful road. While they had managed to survive the ordeal, their futures were marked by the weight of the murders they had committed. Some struggled with guilt and remorse for taking lives, while others clung to the belief that they had no choice. In prison, they were left to reflect on the events that had brought them to such a desperate point. The families of the murdered crew members were also left to cope with the loss of their loved ones. For the families of the Korean officers, the tragedy was an unimaginable blow. They had lost not just their relatives, but their sense of security in a system that had failed to protect them. The ripple effects of the tragedy extended beyond the families of the deceased and the survivors. It affected entire communities and brought attention to the exploitation and violence that often goes unnoticed in the maritime industry. The Pescama legacy, a catalyst for change. On the years following the trial and sentencing, the Pescama tragedy became a symbol of the need for change in the treatment of migrant workers. The international community began to take a closer look at the abuses that had taken place aboard the fishing boats, and efforts to improve labor conditions in the maritime industry gained momentum. The tragedy was seen as a wake-up call, urging governments, shipping companies, and human rights organizations to take action to protect vulnerable workers. Several international laws were introduced in response to the Pescama tragedy, aimed at preventing similar abuses from occurring in the future. The International Labor Organization (ILO) increased its focus on regulating the treatment of migrant workers, and countries around the world began implementing stricter regulations for fishing vessels. However, despite these efforts, much more work remains to be done to ensure the safety and dignity of workers in the global maritime industry. The final reflection: justice, redemption, and moving forward. The Pescama tragedy will forever be remembered as a moment when the world was forced to confront the horrific conditions that many migrant workers endure. It serves as a tragic reminder of the lengths to which people will go when pushed to the brink of survival. For the surviving workers, the legacy of the tragedy is one of both remorse and necessity. For the families of the victims, it remains a painful chapter that will never fully heal. Ultimately, the Pescama tragedy is a story of desperation, survival, and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked abuse. It is a story that raises questions about justice, morality, and the human capacity for violence. It will continue to haunt those involved for the rest of their lives, and it stands as a testament to the power of systemic oppression and the devastating toll it can take on the human spirit. Conclusion: lessons from the Pescama tragedy. Pescama fishing boat tragedy serves as a harsh reminder of the dangers faced by migrant workers across the world. It underscores the need for greater oversight, better working conditions, and stronger protections for those in vulnerable positions. As the survivors move forward and the families of the victims continue to grieve, the world must look to this tragedy not just as a story of murder, but as a powerful catalyst for reform in industries that continue to exploit the most vulnerable people. Part 4: The Aftermath, Lasting Impact and Global Repercussions. Pescama tragedy, which claimed the lives of 11 crew members, is one of the darkest maritime crimes in recent memory. Though the legal battle concluded with convictions and sentences, the story didn't end with the courtroom. The ramifications of the event reached far beyond the individuals involved. The tragedy shook not only the fishing industry, but also served as a wake-up call to governments, organizations, and the world at large about the hidden dangers of exploitation, abuse, and human rights violations in global industries. The global response: a wake-up call for maritime industry. One news of the Pescama tragedy hit the international headlines. It was met with shock and outrage. The fishing industry, particularly in Asia, had long been plagued by allegations of exploitation and labor abuse, but nothing quite like this had ever come to light. the scale of the violence, the brutal nature of the killings, and the fact that they were carried out by the victims themselves created an international outcry. Governments, labor unions, and human rights organizations were forced to take a long, hard look at the practices within the fishing industry. Workers in these industries, often coming from impoverished backgrounds, were regularly subjected to forced labor, inhumane working conditions, long hours, and, as seen with the Pescama crew, physical violence. For years, these abuses had flown under the radar, hidden behind the remoteness of fishing vessels and isolated labor camps. The Pescama incident created a moment of reckoning, where countries across the globe, especially in Southeast Asia and other fishing hubs, could no longer ignore the growing pressure for reform. International labor organizations began calling for stronger regulation of the fishing industry and better enforcement of existing laws. The fishing industry, often governed by complex networks of supply chains, subcontractors, and international shipping companies, proved difficult to regulate. But the tragic deaths aboard the Pescama highlighted how essential it was to ensure accountability at every level. In response to the outcry, global stakeholders began to push for legislation that would enforce stricter labor protections for seafarers, many of whom were at risk of similar abuse. While progress has been made, the story of the Pescama tragedy serves as a constant reminder that the fight for workers' rights, especially in maritime industries, is far from over. The survivors, the heavy price of survival for the survivors of the Pescama tragedy. The journey after the killings was filled with complexities. They had acted out of desperation and anger, but in the aftermath, they were faced with the emotional burden of their actions. The legal process, while bringing some closure in terms of justice, did little to ease the psychological torment they carried with them. Some survivors expressed deep remorse for what they had done, acknowledging the lives lost during their acts of violence. Their guilt was compounded by the understanding that they had taken the lives of not only the officers, but also their fellow workers who had been caught in the crossfire. The men who survived the massacre were now forced to live with the knowledge that they had killed people, even if it was in what they considered an act of self-defense. The sentences handed down to the survivors varied. Some received lengthy prison terms, while others were given lesser sentences or were ultimately released. The legal process was complex, and the question of whether the workers should have been held fully accountable for their actions was a matter of great debate. Some believed that the workers had been victims themselves, driven to violence due to years of suffering. Others felt that regardless of the abuse they had endured, taking human lives could never be justified. Prison life for the survivors was not easy. Many were separated from their families and struggled to adapt to life behind bars. Some became involved in prison advocacy for labor rights, hoping to use their own story as a way to bring attention to the plight of migrant workers in global industries. While they couldn't undo the violence they had committed, some survivors chose to dedicate their lives to raising awareness about the conditions that had led to the tragedy in the first place. The families of the victims navigating grief and injustice for the families of the officers who were killed during the Pescama tragedy. The aftermath was a different kind of torment. They had lost their loved ones, not to a random accident or illness, but to a violent act that no one could have predicted. The fact that the men who had died were in positions of power, as the officers aboard the ship, added a layer of complexity to the grief of their families. While many families expressed anger over the violence that had been committed, others questioned the circumstances that had driven the workers to such desperate acts. For the families of the victims, there was a sense of disbelief that such a tragedy could unfold at sea, far from the reach of any government or law enforcement. The violence that had happened on the ship left deep emotional scars for everyone involved. The families wanted justice, not only for the murder of their loved ones, but also for the broader implications of the case. They wanted the world to understand that, while the workers had committed a heinous crime, the violence was rooted in the systemic exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Though the families were thankful for the convictions, the verdicts did little to ease their grief. Many believed that there had been a failure to prevent the conditions aboard the ship from spiraling out of control. To them, the Pescama tragedy was a reminder that abuses against migrant workers were far too common and that there were too many cases of exploitation that went unnoticed. Lessons learned. Global movements for worker rights in the wake of the Pescama tragedy. Significant efforts were made by human rights organizations, governments, and unions to improve conditions for migrant workers, particularly those working at sea. The tragedy became an emblem of the need for better enforcement of labor laws and the importance of holding corporations accountable for the treatment of workers in their supply chains. One of the key lessons learned from the tragedy was the importance of transparency in the maritime industry. The Pescama case demonstrated how easy it was for abuses to remain hidden in such a remote environment. Workers who are isolated at sea, away from public scrutiny, are at high risk of exploitation and violence. The need for better monitoring and regulation of labor conditions on fishing vessels became more apparent, and it was recognized that international shipping companies must be held responsible for ensuring the safety and well-being of their crew. Members. In response, advocacy groups began pushing for international standards regarding the treatment of workers on fishing vessels. One of the major changes was the implementation of the Maritime Labor Convention (MLC), which set minimum standards for the treatment of seafarers worldwide. However, while this convention has made some strides in improving conditions, there is still much work to be done. Governments must enforce these regulations, and shipping companies need to do more to protect their workers from abuse. The tragedy also led to a broader societal shift in awareness. Migrant workers, particularly in industries like fishing, construction, and agriculture, began to receive more attention in global discussions about workers' rights. Their plight became an issue of social justice, and the Pescama tragedy helped mobilize support for policies that sought to end exploitation and violence in labor industries. The future, still a long road ahead as we look at the legacy of the Pescama tragedy today. It's clear that significant strides have been made in terms of global awareness and international law. The tragedy was a painful catalyst for change, but the issues it raised are far from resolved. Migrant workers continue to face significant challenges, and the fishing industry remains one of the most perilous sectors for exploitation and abuse. The survivors of the Pescama tragedy, as well as the families of the victims, have had to navigate their own paths to healing, each in their own way. Some have turned to advocacy and activism, others have struggled with guilt and remorse, and many continue to grapple with the consequences of that terrible night. But one thing is certain: the story of the Pescama will not be forgotten. It serves as a stark reminder of the potential horrors that can unfold when human lives are treated as expendable, and it calls for a global effort to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. Thank you for watching and following the tragic story of the Pescama fishing boat. This case, like so many others, is a reminder that behind every headline is a story of human suffering and resilience. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of real-life mysteries and the dark side of industries that exploit the most vulnerable people. We want to hear your thoughts. What do you think of the Pescama tragedy and the actions of those involved? How can we work to prevent such abuses from happening again? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. Remember, it's essential to keep these conversations going and stay aware of the injustices happening in industries that affect workers globally. Your support helps us bring attention to these crucial issues. Thank you for staying with us. And until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and continue questioning the systems that govern us all.